Gonzalez-Bailon. I'm a research fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute, and I'll be chairing this session. And this is the So What session. This is where we're going to assess to what extent social media have really changed the rules of the game and open up access to the public domain, to the public attention, to sectors of the population that would have remained silent or invisible otherwise. And I guess that the first big question here is, when we assess the impact of blogs and other forms of social media, how do we actually measure that impact? Yes, there are several stories of success that show that social media can definitely increase the power of lay people and make more efficient their coordination and therefore more likely their success. But there are also lots of less successful stories. There's definitely way more unsuccessful stories than successful ones where the use of social media has not really made that much difference. And so the question that I would like the speakers, who I will introduce shortly to you, the question that I would like them to consider and to tackle is, what do we know about the use of social media to understand better this discrepancy in outcomes? And this question implies other questions, such as who is using social media, who gets most of the attention and visibility, and why, and how much evidence do we actually have to claim that social media have enhanced meaningful collaboration or democratic engagement or the accountability of the authorities and traditional news media? And do social media really pose a challenge to authoritarian regimes, or is it just, are they just opening another way of controlling individuals? So to answer these and other questions, we count with the contribution of 4 speakers. They are Stefan Niggemeier, who is a media correspondent and founder of the prize-winning Bild blog. We've got Evgeny Morozov, Yahoo fellow at Georgetown University and frequent commentator on the political implications of the internet. We have Richard Allan, who's a technology policy specialist, currently leading Facebook's public policy work in Europe. And last but not least, we have Matthew Heinemann, who's an assistant professor of political science at Arizona State University and author of The Myth of Digital Democracy. So we're going to start with Stefan. Social media, so what?
I don't know if I'm the right person to answer that because, well, I founded and I run Bild blog, which is a blog in Germany, which I don't think is your typical thing that you would call social media. What we do is we're a watch blog for the biggest European newspaper, biggest German newspaper, Bild, which is horrible in terms of how it does its journalism. It's very irresponsible, but it's very influential. It's taken very seriously, so that's why we started this blog 5 years ago. And in a way, we are very traditional media because we are a group of journalists who write all the entries. But we depend very much on our audience, our readers, to send us hints and tips and things where they say they've come across something in Bild that's wrong or that shouldn't be there. And we get dozens of those mails every day, and we very much depend on it. We couldn't do what we do every day, exposing the mistakes of the newspaper Bild, if there weren't these readers who help us and who are very keen to help us. That's one of the wonders for me. When I worked as a journalist, I never thought there was this potential. So many people wanting to get involved, wanting to help, and not actually gaining anything. They get a mention, but it's really just because they want to help us. We've become one of the biggest blogs in Germany. We have about 1 million visits every month. And so in a way, yes, that's social media because we couldn't do it otherwise. And if we ask, so what? I guess for me, the question, of course, is, has Bild blog made any difference? I think it has. You can't really tell from Bild, I think. That's probably the most difficult way to tell if we've made a difference because it's very hard to say if the newspaper has changed. They want to be the way they are, and I don't think they are that impressed by us exposing all their mistakes. But I do think we've made a difference in talking to the readers, trying to tell the audience what this newspaper is like and what its flaws are. And of course, again, getting people involved. We give everyone who's discussing stories from Bild good arguments against it. Something that I find fascinating is when you follow discussions online in forums or whatever, people discussing football or politics or whatever, and someone quotes a story from Bild, it won't take long now until someone comes up in the forum and says, oh, hang on, is Bild your source? Check out Bild blog. And so we can really see how the news spreads and how I think we are working to limit the power of Bild by pointing out how it cannot be trusted. The other thing, aside from Bild blog, I think, which is interesting from a German perspective, is that we have a kind of an open experiment at the moment that's really going to answer, to give one answer to the question, social media, so what? And it's the success of the Pirate Party. I don't know whether that's, they've arrived in Britain yet. They got quite a boost in Germany a couple of months ago when our Secretary for Families and Social Secretary, I guess, launched just in time before the elections this idea that Germany should block access to child porn sites. And not to have them removed, but to actually just put a stop sign in front of them, which sounds like a good idea unless you start to really look into it, how it works, and that you would actually create a whole system. There would be a list of all the alleged sites with child pornography that then would be blocked, and there's actually no checks and balances. There's no judge involved to say, yes, this site can be blocked and this can't. And it really boosted this movement of the Pirate Party, of lots of people you could see trying to get involved because they saw that it was a threat to the freedom of the internet in Germany. And I think it's an issue that would normally have been a really simple PR success. A secretary for the government saying, oh, we are going to remove all this child pornography, and everyone would applaud. And it was really interesting how many people got involved, signed an e-petition that you can do in Germany to the Bundestag, to the parliament, even though it's such a tricky business because you could instantly be called someone who wants to protect child pornography, which no one wants. It's really about the means to do something about it. But it was the biggest e-petition ever. Over 100,000 people signed it. And as I said, it gave a lot of support to this newly founded Pirate Party, which is mostly about freedom of the internet. And we're going to have a general election in a week, and I don't think they'll quite make it into parliament yet, but they are tipped to get about 2 or 3% of the vote, which would be amazing, and I think which would be a strong answer to the question, social media, so what?
Okay. So, Evgeny, you've written quite a lot about the political implications of new media and technology. Do you think it is really democratizing? When we look at the bigger picture, is it really making a difference and democratizing access to the public domain and making easier?
Sure. Well, my focus has mostly been on the role it plays in authoritarian states, right? In places like China, like Iran, like much of the former Soviet Union and Central Asia and so forth. And I started as someone who was very idealistic and optimistic about the role that new media can play in democratizing those societies, in part because I myself come from Belarus, a country which is not known for its freedoms. And I've spent a lot of time working for NGOs which were actually trying to use new media to push for more democracy and democratic change in much of the former Soviet Union. However, over the last several years, I've discovered that a lot of these actions and campaigns that we are trying to have were having very little impact. I mean, paradoxically, many of the countries in Central Asia, for example, were actually getting more authoritarian and less free, right? Whether it has anything to do with the internet is a secondary point, but I was definitely beginning to see the limitations of using social media for, pushing for democracy and democratic change. So what I would like to do today is try to push a little bit back on this narrative of social media and new media and the internet as the greatest democratizer of public spheres, particularly in countries like China and Russia. I think it is certainly true that some people, and particularly activists and NGOs, are becoming more effective because of the techniques that they pick up online, because of the software like Skype that they use for communications, and because of many other productivity saving and generating tools, right? This is not to deny that activists are benefiting from it. However, to really understand the impact that the internet has on a society, we have to look much broader than that, and we have to examine what happens to people who are not activists, right? What happens to people who are not yet involved in pushing for democracy? What happens to people who are needed in the streets to push for the next revolution, right? And once we start examining what's happening on this level, situation is much more complicated and much less clear-cut. In part because the governments themselves have actively been using new media and social media to tighten their grip on power. If you look really systematically at the new media strategies of the governments in Russia, China, Iran, and elsewhere, you'll actually see that the Chinese, for example, run their own propaganda units known as 50 Cent Party, right? And the 50 cent in the name denotes the amount of money that the commentators get for each comment that they leave online, right? So essentially, you have 200,000 people scattered around the country, all local and national levels, who are actually being paid for finding interesting but ideologically incoherent discussions, and then leaving and inserting their own comments into them, and just trying to hijack the discussion into a direction which is favorable to the government. Right? You more or less see the same happen in terms of religious discourse in Iran, where the government, we may not realize this, but since 2005, the government have actually, and the clerics have been running dedicated workshops on blogging in Qom, the major religious center, where there was a particular focus to actually train people how to blog, because the clerics want to make sure that any discourse on religion happening in the Iranian cyberspace is actually clearly outlined within their own interpretation of Shia, right? So it's not as if, suddenly we all got our voices and we can all speak up and express ourselves. It's that the actors who used to be less effective in the digital age, and the government might be one of them, actually acquiring the very same techniques and are using them to push for their own agenda and to push for their own points. What we also have to remember is that cyberspace has made it really easy for the same governments to monitor and survey what's happening in their countries. I mean, if you think about it, if you look back into how they used to get data, if you wanted to know the social connections of a particular dissident, you would probably need to go and spend a lot of time investigating who he has spoken to, whom they have met. You may need to torture them to find out who they're related to. I mean, now you can go and get this data from Facebook. It's all available there. You have to go and look and see who this person is connected to. And more than that, many of these people are completely at ease displaying their connections to even their Western supporters. And many Western supporters are eagerly showing that they're supporting these causes, which are also, putting the same very people, under danger and putting them under some threat. So we have to be very careful. I mean, you have the Chinese government, again, employing very sophisticated data mining companies, based in China, which employ hundreds of people whose whole job is to basically make sure that this monitoring is done efficiently and effectively and at the most cost-effective manner. So every time you mention a particular keyword like democracy, human rights, that discussion is being identified, and then the government dispatches this propaganda units, the 50 Cent Party or anyone else affiliated with the government who has a basic knack for social media. And we have to keep that perspective in mind. But even beyond this, we have to understand that access by itself doesn't necessarily make people aspire for democracy. We can't really build an argument saying that now that half of Russia or half of China are online, they automatically would want to start downloading reports from Human Rights Watch. I mean, I just don't think this is true and this is possible, and most people would actually be downloading movies, entertainment, and pornography. And it's not at all given that they will actually graduate from that stage and and move on to more ambitious political aspirations. And we have to consider all of that because it's not really so much about the internet, it's about social, cultural, and political forces which are shaping the societies. And the internet is just playing, I think, a small role, and it's still mostly decided by other forces. So, when we see that there are a lot of Iranians using Twitter during the recent upheaval in Iran, it doesn't necessarily mean that Twitter was the cause of the uprising, right? We have to keep in mind that, in this case, correlation doesn't imply causation. That you have 5 people actively twittering about what's happening in Tehran doesn't necessarily mean that Twitter has played any role at all. Right? And most curiously, you have, again, now, several months after the events in Tehran happened, you actually start getting reports that the Iranian authorities are very carefully studying all the data that they gathered during this, great internet staged, activity, and actually looking how activists, again, connected to each other, what the Western activists have done to support, and so forth and so forth. So by being very loud about, this whole notion of a Twitter-based revolution, we're actually putting many Iranian activists at risk because now the internet is suddenly perceived as a great threat to authoritarian regimes, and they're actually eager to crack down on it. Right? And they are much more eager to crack down on it than the actual capacity of Twitter warrants, right? So I think I'll stop my remarks here, but I think the broader message is that we should try to restrain from technological determinism and try to shed off the cyber utopian assumptions. Essentially, it all boils down to politics and society and culture, and technology is only playing a very marginal role in it, and we have to be aware of that.
So thank you, Evgeny. I think you've given us a very interesting answer to the so what question. I mean, if Facebook is replacing torture, that's good, but still there's some other evil consequences associated to that. And I'm going to now give the floor to Richard, who I think has a more optimistic view of the potential that new media and internet technologies have to widen participation and to reach sectors of the population that were unreachable so far.
So I think that was well described. I have an optimistic view of the potential, but not necessarily of the reality to date, where I would actually share some of the criticisms about what's taken place. So I wanted really to speak actually primarily from my experience as a political practitioner over a number of years who's been through this whole phase of the early excitement about the internet. I've been active as a politician standing in elections, I guess, since the early 90s. And I was part of that sense, and I think we're particularly talking here about Western democracies where the feeling was that we were in lecture rooms like this, but the audience had left the building. And that was the great concern in politics, that people were no longer with us. And the first phase of excitement about social media, I think, came really from a sense in the political class that here was something that was finally going to answer our questions, that was going to allow us to reach audiences, particularly younger people, who we felt we were no longer in touch with. And I think in that respect, as I'll go on to explain, I don't think that cyber utopia was in any sense realized. But what I do think is happening now around the social web in particular, so those kinds of applications, and I'm so excited about this, I joined a company that kind of produces one, quite deliberately, because I actually think this is a really exciting space. Those applications that allow people to have more ongoing, deeper relationships with each other on a steady basis, and perhaps the original kind of challenge-response model of the blog, where you put something up and somebody responds to it. We're now developing a whole series of technologies under the banner broadly of social web, where people are actually creating networks of relationships and maintaining those on a longer basis. And I think those have, to use that favourite word, some affordances, which are quite exciting from a political point of view. But I say I think it's a potential rather than reality at this stage. I think the being a politician, you kind of you generalise from the particular. That's what we do, and you talk in terms of analogies. So I'll probably do both of those right now, with the excuse that, I say, we are at the early days, so a lot of this is not settled. I think that the early social media phase, to me, it felt very much like we were creating bars online. We were creating spaces like a bar that is theoretically a public open space that everyone can go into, but in reality, bars define themselves. There is a gay bar and a straight bar, a liberal bar and a conservative bar, and they define themselves by a population which actually isn't that mixed, but is actually quite focused. So we were putting our blogs up online, spending a lot of effort on it, political parties were doing all this activity, but they were essentially talking to the same group of people because people were congregating in a bar-like manner. Even though anyone else could come in, they were not choosing to come in. And I think where we're moving to now with some of the social web technologies is something that's more like a festival. So I'm now thinking Glastonbury rather than a bar. If you go to a festival, you still essentially are going to go with a group of friends. You arrive there with a group of like-minded people, but the potential for you to have interactions with things which you hadn't expected and people you hadn't expected, and to reach out and get to know new people and new ideas is much greater in a festival environment than it is within a closed bar. So that's the bit that I think is potentially exciting here. And of course in the bar environment, again, echoing what Evgeny said about the kinds of content, most people in a festival will spend most of their time at the music tents. Tony Benn may turn up at Glastonbury Festival and get a very big audience, but that will be the exception. The political events within that environment are going to be the exception rather than the rule. But Tony Benn, when he arrives at Glastonbury, may well get an audience who no one would ever have seen Tony Benn being a famous left-wing British politician, that no one, an audience of people who would not have reached out or got to know him had he not been at that particular event. So I think there is some possibility for novel connection. And in the Facebook context, I was looking at the stats just now, they sort of bear that out, that Barack Obama has something like 6.7 million followers of his page as the most established politician on Facebook. Michael Jackson has 10.3 million, and if you look at the top 10, most of the others are significant entertainment figures. So I don't think we're going to be exceptional in the social media space or the social web space. Entertainment is still going to dominate over politics, but I'd simply contend that it strikes me as a political practitioner that there are opportunities for this reaching out of friend to friend to friend that have not been there in anything that we've done on the web to date. That's exciting, and I'm trying to recruit a few politicians to act as my guinea pigs so that I can get some data, come back in a couple of years with some data as to whether or not that kind of social web activity really did have some novel democratic potential that things like blogging didn't.
Okay, well, thank you, Richard. Now, Matthew, I think the title of your book, The Myth of Digital Democracy, is quite revealing of your own position in this topic. Now, you're a political scientist. You've done research about the demographics of the groups that use social media. And I was wondering if you have something to tell us about what steps do we need to take to make that potential that Richard was talking about a reality? And you know, how can we improve accessibility to social media and the impact it has?
So, yeah, I think that I would start by making a larger point. If what we're really trying to understand is issues of access and openness to the public sphere, I need to start by disagreeing quite vehemently with some of my colleagues or other folks who have who've spoken today. By my count, at least 6 of the presenters, in one form or another, have talked about low barriers to entry online. I don't care how smart they are, I don't care how handsome they are or how charming, I disagree with them. And let me tell you why. I mean, we're sitting in a business school, and if I were to say to you, I think I've got a great idea, I'm going to start a landline phone company. Or I'm going to go out and I'm going to start a water utility, and I think I'm going to do a great job competing with the local water utility. You think that I was daft, right? Because what every business student learns, you know, the first week of class, right, is a little bit about natural monopoly. And natural monopolies, by definition, are in industries which have very high fixed costs and low marginal costs. So if I'm trying to start a water utility, it's going to cost me thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds to get that first gallon of water to a new household. But it's going to cost me pennies to get that second gallon. Right? One of the most important things that we need to understand about the internet is that in many ways the economics are far less forgiving than we are used to in so-called natural monopolies. If you look at what Google has spent over the past 5-6 years on infrastructure and research and development, it's stunning. Google spends more on equipment than a typical phone company, and then they spend hundreds of millions of dollars more on research and development. In fact, by the end of 2010, Google will have spent more over the past 6-year period than the entire Manhattan Project during World War II, just on creating their search engine and hosting it. those are not favorable economics for low barriers to entry. And in fact, it's no surprising that we don't see low barriers to entry in pretty much any defined niche on the web. Now, I'm sure that some of my fellow commenters will point, well, what about this site, which didn't exist 5 years ago? What about this site that didn't exist 8 years ago, and that we now all use on a regular basis? And it's certainly true that the web, being new, has lots of new niches, and that once upon a time, most of these new niches were not filled and that were relatively open. If I wanted to start an online bookstore in 1996, I would have had a decent chance of doing that. Trying to do that in 2006 is almost impossible when Amazon is spending $500 million a year just maintaining and creating and hosting their website. So I couldn't agree more that in any established part of the web, in any established niche, that barriers to entry are likely to be extremely high by the comparison of any other area of business. And that means that again and again and again we see choke points with regard to social media. And that may be good business, but I think that raises some important questions if we're really looking to private corporations to serve important public goods. And in terms of who actually uses these technologies, I think that we see again and again that they map onto existing social cleavages. So if we look at MySpace versus Facebook in the United States, for example, I think that it's quite clear that the demographics of MySpace users are quite different than the demographics of Facebook users in terms of the race and ethnicity, in terms of gender, in terms of where they're located geographically. MySpace tends to be more the interior country, in the interior of the country, whereas Facebook is mostly on the coast. So I think that those become more and more important, particularly when we try to talk about the public sphere and ultimately about politics and political organizing. And this also leads to another larger point, which is that we talk a lot about democratization, but of course democracy is a whole messy business, and democratic values is not just one value, but a whole series of conflicted and often values that are in tension with one another. And I think that it would be impossible for any technology to make all of these values better at once. And I think that's exactly what we've seen with the internet. That in terms of who's actually able to reach an audience, the American public sphere has never been as exclusionary before as it is now in the 21st century. Certainly the gatekeepers look different. But if you start looking at who actually receives a substantial amount of views on his or her blog, what you find is that these commentators are disproportionately male, they're disproportionately white, they are hugely disproportionately highly educated, disproportionately they have higher ed degrees. And in some ways, if what we're worried about is people writing poor quality content, then that may be some indirect indicator that may reassure us a little bit about what's actually being produced. But if our goal is to try and make the public sphere accessible to the sorts of people who are taking their lunch pail to work, then the internet has been a dismal failure. And so. Simply because we have a strong marketplace of ideas doesn't necessarily mean that the internet is good for every democratic value. And in fact, the fact that the marketplace of ideas online is more ferocious than it has ever been is in many ways a challenge that we still don't have, we still have only imperfect ways of addressing. But this sort of brings me to my last point. We need to be very careful in distinguishing between coordination and deliberation. And the conclusions we make about how quote-unquote democratic the web is depends very much on our expectations. So let me take one last example. Barack Obama's campaign for president, which was widely celebrated as the most grassroots political operation in American history. And from a certain perspective, that's absolutely right. But you could look at the same campaign and make an equally strong case that this was by far the most top-down, most centralized political campaign in American history. Traditionally, the way that campaigns in America and most Western democracies work is you have people who are recruited into politics and political activity through local social networks. In the Obama campaign, that's not how it happened. Individuals became interested in the campaign by consuming traditional media, to some extent consuming blogs. They went to the Obama campaign website, they put in their email address and their zip code, and the Obama campaign created for them a local social network. All right? So who's being left out? I mean, really, in many ways, the settlement of the internet revolution, in some ways, really resembles the settlement of a much older revolution, right? This is king and commons. What we're really doing is we are disintermediating politics. We are gutting the traditional middle aristocracy of politics and political organizing. And what we're doing instead is creating a much more direct relationship between national political campaigns and people on the ground. And in some ways, of course, many folks like that. But I think it's important to not take our eye off the ball and remember that in just talking about the internet, we shouldn't forget about the other information technologies which are part and parcel of the changes that we're talking about. So the way that Barack Obama won Ohio, for example, was through widespread application of much more effective political targeting than has ever been seen in American politics before. Using statistical models to figure out, just based on demographics and previous history, whether somebody's door that you're knocking on is likely to be a Democrat or a Republican. And Obama's margin in Ohio comes largely from much better performance in solidly Republican areas of the state, because they were able to target far more effectively. And again, all of this targeting is done by elites. It's done by paid political consultants. It may be interfaced by citizens through the website, but that doesn't necessarily mean that politics, in this sense, is getting more democratic. So if we really are focused on coordination, then I think that we can certainly find dramatic impacts of the internet. If we're really hoping for a certain kind of public deliberation, I think that we still have a very long way to come.
Well, thank you very much, Matthew. Your contribution has guaranteed a lively debate, I'm sure of that. But before I let the audience contribute also to this dialogue, I would like to go back to this idea that a couple of speakers mentioned this morning about the unintended consequences of technology and new media. So how do you think, what do you think is the most important unintended consequence of blogs and Twitter and Facebook? And how does it fit in your vision of how these technologies can change participation and impact? So Stefan, if you want to.
It's hard to say what the unintended consequences, because I don't think there's necessarily an intention. I mean, the beauty of it is that it's so easy to use all these tools, I guess, to your own end. That's what we talked about before as well, how you can use all these things that people come up with for spam and for evil things. So I don't think there's a single thing. I find it hard to limit it to unintended consequences. I would like to take issue with what you said about how high the level is to get involved. And of course, you're right when you see it from a business point of view. If I wanted to start a company on the internet, that may be not as easy as many people think. And I think at the beginning of the century, many people found out how difficult that can be anyway. But on another level, it is true that it's so much easier, just on the level of being able to be heard, to say something and to reach an audience. And the cost of that used to be enormous. I would have to have a newspaper or something like that. And now I can say things, and if they are interesting enough, if enough people pick them up, they can be heard. And that, I know that doesn't happen all the time, and not everyone who wants to be heard gets heard. And I think sometimes you're very strict in saying this isn't a democracy if we don't succeed on all levels. But I think it is far more democratic because you can, from all points of society, you suddenly get people who get heard because everyone tells their story, and eventually the mass media picks them up and they get another boost. And I think, yeah, that's made a big difference.
I think that your comment really encapsulates, I think, the important distinction that we now face, and I think shows us just how different the paradigm is with the internet than what we're used to in traditional media. Traditional media, if you publish, you will be heard. That's not true online. Anybody can post their own thoughts online. But in response to your comment and previous panelists, the claim has been made that I don't need to ask permission in order to reach an audience. Yes, actually you do. If you want to actually have large numbers of people to read what you're writing, you need to capture the attention of one of the larger bloggers. This is a dynamic we see in the blogosphere all the time. Now, it's true that there are a plurality of routes, and that there's not just one single political blog. And to some extent, there is a diversity of opinion and a diversity of senses of what is important, what is good quality content. And so, in that sense, it may be slightly more open. But if you compare the political blogosphere in the US, for example, with the larger political landscape, you find dramatic differences in terms of the ideological views of bloggers versus the public as a whole. You find almost no union presence online. Almost none. Religious conservatives, an important part of the American political landscape, are certainly dramatically underrepresented online. And these have real-world political consequences. Again, I think that now if our goal is certain kinds of accountability, it may be that college professors are better at providing, certain kinds of accountability. As a Ivy League college professor, I'm not entirely complaining about this, right? We've been so successful in the past few years. We elected one of our own president of the United States, right? Which was, if you'd asked me 10 years ago whether that was possible, I would have laughed at you. But I think that, simply because the barriers are different, and simply because some barriers have disappeared, doesn't necessarily mean that things are all that open. Simply because we've moved from the production of information to the filtering of information being the big barrier, doesn't necessarily mean that the public sphere in general is all that open.
So, Evgeny, do you have any reactions?
I can answer your original question about the unexpected consequences. And I'll beat the same drum about, authoritarianism and new media. And I think if my basic hunch is correct, that is that social media can actually strengthen authoritarian regimes, then what we'll see is that, it's also actually delaying the end of history, which may not sound surprising to anyone who disagreed with Fukuyama in the past. But yes, it may be the case that authoritarian regimes like China and Iran and Russia will not be falling and will be adapting themselves to the new reality, in part utilizing social media. And I think we have to realize that the fact that more and more citizens in those countries are engaging in deliberation with each other doesn't necessarily mean that it undermines or threatens the stability of the regime, because these regimes essentially lack information they need to govern. Right? They don't know what's happening in the remote Chinese village. They don't know what's happening in the remote Russian village. Having those people express their disagreements and voice their concerns online is actually a great benefit, because you can identify what's wrong with your regime, what's wrong with your country, smartly aggregate this data, rely on the same very techniques, rely on wikis, social networks, blogs, have a much better picture of what's wrong with your country, then go and fix it. And people will be happy because they get a chance to rant and to express their disagreements, and it has legitimacy to your regime, right? So we have to be very careful about drawing conclusions about the sustainability of authoritarianism. And I think we have to really consider the possibility that the dictators will actually benefit from it much more than the grassroots movements.
Okay. So, Richard, I'm sure that you disagree with Matthew's view of how things have changed or not. Do you want to contribute something?
I don't know, but I don't think I necessarily fundamentally disagree on what's happened today. I'm just actually to speak up Evgeny's point. You described then the regime listening to the views that people express online about particular problems and then responding and fixing them. It kind of sounds like a form of effective democratic It may not have the structures of democracy, but actually sounds like quite
But you have to keep in mind that it only applies to certain problems. I mean, in China, you can as well express views about, the ecological problems, local corruption, and the state will go and fix them. The moment you start criticizing the human rights situation, what's going to happen is that, your blog will be deleted the same very day, right? So the regime is very selective in terms of problems that it wants to tackle, right? The problems which strengthen its existing presence will be tackled. The ones which threaten it will actually not be dealt with, and you'll be punished and, silenced. But, that's...
Okay, that's fine. I mean, in terms of the, Matthew's argument, I think there's an element of glass half empty, glass half full in there. That again, if you, I would take a kind of counterexample, which is transparency about what takes place in your democratic bodies. And I accept in that case it's kind of, the information is state-driven or state-provided, but then we can roll the clock back and recognize that if you wanted to find out what happened in the deliberation of the representatives who make decisions on your behalf, not so very long ago, you had to be in that very small subset of white college professors who could access a library that got the record of Congress or Parliament or whatever, and have the ability to get hold of that data and use it. That data is now available to everyone everywhere. So there's to ignore the advances that have been made in terms of access to information about what government does, the whole movement, the data.gov movement in the US at the moment. So to ignore all of that, I think, is ignoring a very big element of the mix, and simply then to focus on, I think, legitimate concerns about filtering and then who controls the channels of the mass media. But let's also have a sort of half-full glass about the stuff where people do have access to far more information than they ever had before across a much broader social range.
I think that's a useful corrective, and I think that's absolutely right. A couple months ago in Phoenix, a group of friends went out to dinner, and their cars got towed as part of a towing scam. They parked them in a vacant lot with no parking signs, and they got their cars towed. This towing scam had been going on for about a year and a half, probably. But what the people who towed their cars that night didn't realize is they had just towed 3 or 4 of the most prolific Twitterers in the Phoenix area. So within 24 hours, there had been an investigation, and they were on the phone to the mayor and the city council. Within 48 hours, there was a local news coverage in print and on broadcast television. And within 3 days, the scam had been shut down. That's a pretty impressive result for something that had been going on so quickly, for so long, to have it end so quickly. And I think it's that kind of coordination that really, I don't think you can not argue that's had a dramatic effect on politics. In places like Iran, and also just at very small scale level.
But I think many people experience that they make a difference by using these tools and by engaging in these conversations on the internet. And I don't think any of these Colombians for whom Facebook work will think less of the success and the usefulness of that tool if he hears about Venezuela. So I think I'm going to go with half full tonight.
Good. So, Ginny.
Well, I'll probably go for half empty, but with a footnote. And the footnote would say that, despite the political effects it may have on societies, we shouldn't underestimate the empowering effects it has on individuals. It may as well be that Iranians, Russians, and Chinese and Egyptians are getting much more personal autonomy, and the cyberspace is playing a crucial role in it. They are experimenting with more religious, social, and maybe even political ideas in their own private space, right? And they're accessing much more controversial content than their parents could, 20, 30 years ago. However, they may not necessarily be a political movement for various reasons coming out of that, and this is where I think we really have to think harder to understand how this personal autonomy will translate into a push for democracy and not for just better lifestyle, Singapore style.
So, Richard?
I started half full and still half full. I think the agenda's actually been put together quite smartly. I was looking at Andrew's comment up there saying, why are we even debating whether or not technology has an impact on politics? And I noticed the next session we're going to get one, which is going to set out, I think, probably in more detail some of these direct impacts that it has had. But I'm half full, and my personal experience is that I find more people engage in politics more substantively in the world that I work in, at least in part because they have access to tools that have made that more accessible and actually put it in front of them when previously it wasn't there.
Okay. So, good.
I'm not sure if I can give you an easy answer to that question, but I can say definitively that I wouldn't want to go back. So for all of the problems and criticisms I had, I stand by that. Yeah, absolutely.
So thank you, everybody. Thank you, speakers.